August 1940. 11 months into World War II. Poland and France have fallen. Germany continues fighting in the West, now preparing for a showdown with its last major adversary, Britain. In the East, meanwhile, the USSR acquires 3 new Soviet republics, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All 3 had previously been independent and had even banned their local communist parties. The Soviet period in the history of the Baltic states is today commonly referred to as the period of Soviet occupation. Occupation implying that the USSR seized the Baltics against their will. This conflicts with the narrative of Soviet historians, who claim that the Baltic peoples, unlike their Western-backed political elites, were sympathetic to the ideals of the Bolshevik Revolution. According to Soviet historiography, what happened in the Baltics in the summer of 1940 was not an occupation, but rather a revolution. The people rose up, overthrew their oppressive governments, and willingly joined the Soviet family. This telling continues to be supported by Russia today. On the surface, it may indeed seem that the Baltics weren't occupied. Unlike Finland in the famous Winter War, the Baltic states put up no armed resistance when the Red Army entered their homelands in 1939. Why did the peoples of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania not fight? This video will focus on 2 key historical periods, the Second World War and the 2 decades between the First and Second World Wars, a time known as the Interwar. To better understand the geopolitical reality of the Baltics during the post-World War I era and their relationship with Russia, we'll begin with a quick journey through their history, starting all the way back in the 13th century. Medieval Estonia and Latvia were essentially German colonies, conquered during the Northern Crusades of the 13th century. The formerly pagan Estonian and Latvian lands came to be known as Livonia. Most of Livonia later passed to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1629, Livonia came under the control of the Swedish Empire. Yet, throughout both Polish and Swedish rule, political power locally remained in the hands of the Baltic German nobility. In 1721, as a result of the Great Northern War, Sweden lost Livonia to the Russian Empire. Yet, even under Russian rule, local affairs continued to be dominated by the German political elite. Pagan Lithuanians, too, were a target of the Northern Crusades. In 1236, however, they managed to catch the advancing Crusaders, led by Master Volkwin, off guard, and push them into a swampland. The battle was brief and one-sided. Master Volkwin and his men were doomed from the very start. They were mounted, heavily armed, and in an alien land. The Lithuanian bog was their grave. This disastrous defeat brought a halt to the Crusader penetration into Lithuania from the north. The Old Prussians, another Baltic pagan tribe, acted as a buffer in the southwest, holding back the German advance across the great European plain. This bought Lithuanians time. The threat posed by the Crusaders, among other factors, pressured pagan Lithuanians to unify and form a centralized state. This unification enabled the creation of larger, better organized armies and, crucially, the ability to engage in diplomacy. As a centralized political entity, Lithuania could now negotiate and form alliances. These new advantages allowed Lithuania not only to withstand the German Crusaders, but also to help deliver a decisive blow at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. There, Lithuanian forces, fighting alongside the Poles and other allies, brought the Teutonic Order to a defeat. In 1721, Sweden ceded conquered Estonian and Latvian lands to Russia. Lithuania of 1721, on the other hand, was still the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a sovereign state in a union with the Kingdom of Poland. This union, known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was completely wiped off the map toward the century's close in 1795, when it was partitioned by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The greater part of Lithuanian lands went to Russia. With that, all 3 Baltic peoples came under the rule of the Tsar. which itself persisted until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Triggered during World War I, the Russian Revolution plunged the already struggling Russian Empire into further disarray. As the Russian army collapsed and retreated, German forces advanced. By November 1918, however, the Germans had been defeated in the west and forced to surrender. Two of the greatest continental empires had fallen. Seizing their opportunity amidst these history-altering developments, the Baltic nations declared independence. Lenin had pledged to respect the self-determination of the peoples once subject to Tsarist rule, but the Soviets did not maintain this pretense for long. As soon as the defeated Germans capitulated, the Soviets annulled the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the treaty by which Russia had withdrawn from the war, and launched an offensive of their own. The Soviets did not intend to uphold their end of the bargain. Rosa Luxemburg, the famous revolutionary, though Polish by birth and possessing love for the language of her homeland, remained opposed to the idea of an independent Polish state. She was hostile to Russian Tsarist oppression, yet also held nationalism in contempt, deeming it a reactionary force, serving but the bourgeoisie. After all, Marxism did promise a world without nations. With World War I coming to a close, Lenin believed that Germany, now defeated and unstable, also stood on the brink of a socialist revolution, one that needed just a push. In the end, though, Soviet offensive failed. The Red Army was undone by the Poles in the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920. Faced with mounting resistance, the USSR was forced to concede and recognize the independence of the three Baltic nations. By 1923, the fighting had largely ended, and the now independent Baltic states entered a period of relative peace. Latvia and Estonia had endured centuries of German colonial influence. In the 20th century, Lithuanians too were acquainted with the so-called Drang nach Osten, and not just from the chronicles, where their struggles against the Crusaders are recorded. During the First World War, Lithuania endured a harsh and exploitative military occupation under German administration, which showed little interest in recognizing the nation's aspirations for independence. All three Baltic nations had also been subjected to Russian imperial rule in the 18th and 19th centuries, and had to fight the Soviets for their independence between 1918 and 1920. All of this is to say that, in the period between the First and Second World Wars, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania rightly viewed both Germany and the USSR as threats to their sovereignty. The still young Baltic states feared that Germany's imperial ambitions had been only briefly interrupted by its defeat in World War I. They counted on the USSR to keep those ambitions in check. It was a strategy that would, by the end of the 1930s, develop into what some historians now call the policy of absolute neutrality. The logic behind Baltic neutrality was based on the interests of great powers. Germany was interested in controlling the Baltics, or, at the very least, ensuring that its rival, the USSR, did not. Likewise, the USSR was also interested in controlling the Baltics, particularly for access to their ice-free ports, since the port of St. Petersburg froze in winter. Or, at the very least, to ensure that its rival Germany did not. The Baltic states, for their part, wished to remain independent and outside the sphere of influence of both Germany and the USSR. This strategy wasn't exactly a secret. In the aftermath of World War I and the ensuing efforts to reorganize Europe, Lithuanian diplomats argued at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference that the Baltic states would serve as a buffer between Russia and Germany. This was a matter of particular importance to France and Britain, which were concerned with preserving stability and the balance of power in Eastern Europe, amid the vacuum of power that had emerged following the collapse of the German and Russian empires. The strategy of Baltic neutrality, however, rested on two assumptions. First is that Germany and the USSR were natural enemies, and second, that they would not go into an all-out war with one another, a war in which the Baltic states would end up as war spoils for whichever side emerged victorious. This turned out to not be the case. But before we proceed further, let us pause to consider whether any true alternative to neutrality existed. the Baltic states were caught between two military giants. The League of Nations, which was in practice dominated by France and Britain, and joined by the Baltic states, was largely impotent and unable to guarantee their security. An option was Intermarium. It was a regional alliance of Central and Eastern European states, envisioned by Polish leader Józef Pilsudski. Though ambitious and promising, the project was ultimately unachievable, in part due to Poland's conflict with Lithuania over the Vilna region, which complicated regional relations and discouraged countries like Latvia from aligning too closely with Poland, as Latvians preferred to avoid entanglement in the dispute. Yet another option was a Scandinavian-Baltic alliance, Balto-Scandia, but this was even more unrealistic. The Scandinavian countries had no interest in entangling themselves in the precarious situation of the Baltics, nor did they have a strong economic incentive to do so. In short, the Baltic states stood alone. Seeking refuge in neutrality ended up being the only real option. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a non-aggression treaty between Germany and the USSR, signed on the 24th of August, just days before the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of the Second World War. It divided Eastern Europe into two spheres of influence, one German, the other Soviet. Estonia and Latvia fell into the Soviet sphere. Lithuania was initially placed under German influence, but after Lithuanians repeatedly rejected Germany's enticements to join the offensive against Poland, and following the Soviet Union's entry into the war, Lithuania too was transferred to the Soviet sphere. These territorial transfers were not yet known to the Baltics. A few weeks after the outbreak of the Second World War, the Soviets approached each of the Baltic states with a request. When met with resistance, this request hardened into an ultimatum. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were to permit Soviet troops entry into their territories, ostensibly so the Red Army could establish a defensive line should the war spill further east. The Baltic states hardly had the means to resist with military force, and Germany, though certainly displeased with the Soviet military presence on its eastern flank, was already officially at war with Britain and France, and not yet prepared to open the Eastern Front. Additionally, had the Baltics chosen to mount armed resistance, it would have, in the eyes of their governments at the time, definitively closed the door to any future compromise with the communists that might preserve Baltic sovereignty. Better, they reasoned, to negotiate on Soviet terms than to be left with no option to negotiate at all. When the ultimatums were delivered, the Soviets insisted that they had no intention of infringing upon Baltic independence, and claimed that the Red Army bases would, in fact, serve to protect their sovereignty. With no real alternative, the Baltic governments accepted the ultimatums. The Red Army entered the Baltics. A full Sovietization of the Baltic countries in 1939 and early 1940 would have been premature. It would have provoked the West and irritated Germany. At the time, the USSR was also preoccupied with the famous Winter War with Finland. But things escalated quickly. By May of 1940, Germany had made significant advances in Northern and Western Europe. The Baltic states were of considerable economic interest for Germany. After the occupation of neutral Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, the Soviet press began voicing concerns that the neutral Baltics might meet a similar fate. Thus, the Soviets decided that the time had come. In June 1940, the Baltics were given a second ultimatum. They were to form new governments more amenable to Moscow's interests, and to allow additional Soviet troops to occupy key strategic positions in their countries. Once again, the Baltic states tried to protest, and once again, in the end, they had no choice but to yield to Soviet demands. USSR's Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, the same Molotov who had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, coldly and dismissively told the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, Juozas Urbšys, who had been summoned to Moscow, that it actually doesn't even matter whether the response to the ultimatum is negative or positive. Come tomorrow, the Red Army would enter Lithuania regardless. The ultimatums were accepted. In July 1940, sham elections were held in the Baltics. Non-communist candidates were disqualified. On July 21st, the newly formed communist parliament in Estonia demanded the nationalization of all urban and rural property, as well as all industries. It proclaimed a socialist Soviet republic and applied for membership in the USSR. Latvia and Lithuania soon did the same. The presidents of Latvia and Estonia, Ulmanis and Pats, met fates somewhat similar to that of the last Tsar, Nicholas II. In July 1940, they were forced to resign and deported to Central Russia, where they eventually perished. The Lithuanian president Smetona managed to flee, first to Germany, and later to the United States. This was not an act of cowardice, but a last-ditch effort to save the country. By refusing to hand himself over to the Soviets, he denied them the chance to force his resignation and use it to legitimize the new communist regime. In the end, though, it made no difference. In August 1940, the Supreme Soviet, the highest governing body of the USSR, ratified the applications for the admission of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. The Sovietization process accelerated. Banks and industries were nationalized wholesale, along with churches and schools. Religion was purged from school curricula, and religious publications were banned. Monasteries and seminaries were turned into barracks for the Red Army. Monks were evicted or forced to seek shelter elsewhere. Ideological uniformity was imposed, and all dissent crushed through police terror. The culmination of the communist terror in the Baltics during the 1940 to 1941 Sovietization period came with the June 1941 deportation. More than 60,000 Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian men, women and children were taken from their homes, loaded into cattle wagons, and shipped to the depths of Russia. This happened just 1 week before the launch of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. The June deportation reinforced Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian animosity toward the Soviets. The arrival of German troops was thus initially greeted with optimism. It was an opportunity to find refuge from the terror of Bolshevism. Even before the Germans arrived, armed revolts against the Soviets broke out. Hopes ran high that by seizing control during the brief window between the Soviet retreat and the German advance, and then greeting the Germans while already in control of key governmental institutions, Lithuanian and Latvian people might persuade the Third Reich to recognize their independence. But the Germans had no intention of granting the Baltics sovereignty. Instead, they placed the region under Zivilverwaltung, a civilian administration led by Reich commissars, and established Reichskommissariat Ostland. Ostland was to be incorporated into the Third Reich and, in time, Germanized. Any hopes for mutually beneficial cooperation between Baltic nationalists and the Germans quickly faded. After retreating in June 1941, the Red Army returned to the Baltics in 1944. Determined to reimpose their rule, the Soviets were now no less cruel than before. Another wave of mass deportations swept away thousands to remote and inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union. At the same time, a large-scale resettlement program brought foreign, mostly Russian-speaking, Soviet workers. While population transfers in the USSR ended in 1952, the policy of Russification continued well beyond. To put this into perspective, the native Estonian population within Estonia declined from 97% in 1945 to 61% by 1989. According to Soviet Estonian historian Viktor Marmägi, the first Baltic deportations, those preceding the Nazi invasion in June 1941, had a strategic purpose. They deprived the Germans of a potential fifth column. But not even mentioning the fact that a large portion of deportees were not able-bodied men, but women and children, Marmägi's flimsy rationale cannot account for the subsequent policies aimed at dismantling Estonian national identity. The horror that followed the Soviet occupation deeply agitated the Baltic peoples. While their governments in 1940 had deemed armed resistance against the Red Army futile, various groups went underground between 1944 and 1945 and launched a guerrilla war. These partisans came to be known as the Forest Brothers. True to their name, the partisans vanished into the forests, where they found shelter and refuge. Active fighting continued into the 1950s, with the partisans speculating that the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union might escalate into open conflict. In such a scenario, they believed, Western intervention could help restore their independence. By 1950, the CIA was actually interested in the Baltics, and communication with the Forest Brothers was established. But war between the West and the USSR never came, and the Soviets ultimately crushed the partisan movement. The Baltic governments saw resistance to the Soviet invasion as futile. But how did ordinary people react to the arrival of Red Army troops and the sudden emergence of communist regimes? One must first consider the political landscape within the Baltics on the eve of World War II. By 1939, the three countries, like a good portion of Europe, had spent years under dictatorial governments. Yet, in the Baltic states, unlike in Nazi Germany for example, the regimes were relatively restrained. They suppressed opposition, but not with the same brutality. They did not construct a racial ideology, nor did they embrace militarism. They were not totalitarian. But what am I getting at here? The point is that this form of governance, where there's neither democracy nor a strong totalitarian militaristic dictatorship, ultimately proved to be rather impotent. Rather than inspiring loyalty and mobilizing the masses, the Baltic regimes alienated their citizens from politics altogether. As a result, when Soviet troops arrived in October 1939, and then communist parties took power following the sham elections of July 1940, the general population was politically disoriented, detached, uncertain, and passive. Moreover, the communists installed at the head of government shortly before each Baltic state's incorporation into the USSR were not Russian outsiders, but carefully picked native political activists, familiar to the local people. In June 1940, Lithuanian communists issued proclamations to their nation, insisting that no Sovietization was underway, and that the Red Army, which had been permitted to enter the country, was present only to safeguard the nation's independence. As these spokesmen were natives, familiar to the people, these assurances may well have carried a measure of credibility in the eyes of the masses. This allowed for a seemingly orderly incorporation of the Baltics into the USSR. The Baltics became communist after the USSR militarily occupied them during World War II and imposed far-reaching nationalization reforms. These reforms did not come from the people, who were, for the most part, politically passive. It was a top-down revolution carried out by the totalitarian Bolshevik regime. The elections of July 1940, through which the communists came to power, were held under Red Army occupation. Non-communist candidates were disqualified, and the elections themselves were illegal and blatantly rigged. In 1939, the USSR had its eyes on Finland, which led to the Winter War. And although Finland technically lost the war, it was overall a major strategic victory. Most importantly, Finland preserved its independence. Could the three Baltic states in the south have done the same? Could Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have fought and escaped Soviet terror? It's hard to say. The Baltics faced a grimmer predicament than Finland. For one, the Finns had more favourable terrain and better fortifications, the result of years of preparation. Look up the Mannerheim Line to learn more. Still, some today argue that the Baltic states should have resisted the Soviet takeover, even if defeat was inevitable. The Red Army would almost certainly have overwhelmed them. But open resistance would have forced Moscow to launch an overt invasion, reinforcing the view that the occupation was coercive. International condemnation might also have been sharper, though whether Britain or France could have translated that into meaningful action is doubtful. Even so, a brief military stand might have shaped Soviet decisions. Instead of immediate annexation, the USSR might have settled for looser, satellite-style control, as it later did elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Others suggest that unexpected fighting, given the Red Army's poor performance in Finland, could have disrupted Soviet plans or strained the fragile Nazi-Soviet partnership, possibly affecting German calculations before the Eastern Front began. All of this is highly speculative. yet worth considering even today when reflecting on how a small state might act in the face of a far larger power threatening its existence. What is certain, however, is that armed resistance would have left no room for future claims that the Baltic states had voluntarily joined the Soviet Union. To this day, Russia does not acknowledge that the Baltics were ever occupied. If you learned something new, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in the history of ideologies, the world wars, and other 19th and 20th century political events in Europe, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video.